This podcast is produced by The Brand is Female.
Always was, always will be. Always was, always will be.
Tanse, hello, and welcome back to the Matriarch Movement podcast. I'm your host, Shayla Stonechild, and I'm very excited and humbled to be here with each and every one of you. I can't believe it's 2022 already. I feel like it has been a lifetime in this pandemic. However, we are moving into a new timeline and into a new era of Indigenous people reclaiming their power, utilizing their gifts, and channeling them from Creator. Someone that I have been inspired by for a few years now. I actually met her on the set of Trickster. Her name is Asia Youngman, and she is an award-winning Cree and Métis director and screenwriter from Vancouver, Canada. Her films have been screened at a variety of festivals across Turtle Island, and she has worked on numerous film and TV projects that have been commissioned by CBC, Bell Media, TVO, PBS, TELUS, History Channel, and Chorus Entertainment. She was also the recipient of the 2021 Directors Guild of Canada BC Emerging Green Light. She was chosen to participate in the Amazon Studios iOS pitch program with the TV series that she is co-creating, and she recently signed a blind television deal with Entertainment One. Asia is dismantling barriers against her despite being an Indigenous woman in an industry that has historically and presently denied us. However, we are here to shift that, and Asia is an example of one that is trailblazing that way. I hope you're inspired by her just as much as I was. Hi, thank you so much. Have a blessed day, y'all. Tanse, hello, and welcome to the Matriarch Movement podcast. I'm your host, Shayla Stonechild, and I'm very excited and honored to have Asia Youngman here with me today. Asia, thanks so much for taking the time. If you just want to introduce yourself to the audience, the traditional territory from where you're from, and a little bit about the work that you're currently doing. Hi.
Sure. Tanse Asia Niti Gasson. I'm Cree Métis from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. And right now I'm based in Vancouver on the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm a writer and director. I work in documentary, narrative, and television. And I also own a production company called Visceral Village Productions.
And how was that transition? I had no idea you're actually from Alberta, and I'm also Cree and Métis, so there's some similarities there. How was that transition from moving from Alberta to Vancouver?
Well, I've actually never, my mom is from Alberta. Mom's mom's from Alberta, and there's sort of it was really interesting growing up for me because there was a lot of disconnect from my culture, just because both my parents were adopted, they were part of the 60s scoop, and they were adopted by white families. And so just growing up, there was just a lot of uncertainty with who their biological parents were. And my mom was able to track down her mom, Maggie Belcourt, who lives in Alberta. And so we were able to trace kind of our, ancestry through Maggie, but there's just a lot of uncertainty with, where else we've come from. And of course, I think just my mom kind of being put up for adoption, she just didn't really have the strongest connection with her mom. But of course, this is all related to intergenerational trauma. My grandmother went to residential schools and, was obviously in a place where she didn't feel like she could raise my mom. So I think it's been quite a journey just trying to go back to those roots, learn a bit more about my ancestral homelands, and hopefully kind of build more connections there. I would love to kind of go back to Alberta and find those roots again and just reconnect with some of our relatives. But of course it's hard being in Vancouver and just being, so far removed from that, as I'm sure you kind of also felt as well.
Yeah. I feel Vancouver, it's beautiful, the land. I feel like I get welcomed in by it, but there is this aspect of it's not, I'm also a guest on the unceded Coast Salish territory. And so I think there is an aspect that's your traditional territory often draws you back in no matter how far you may wander. And when did you first move to Vancouver, and why did you make the move to Vancouver?
Well, I grew up in South Surrey, White Rock area.
Okay.
So I spent pretty much all my childhood, my teenage years there. And then I went to university on Vancouver Island. And so I was at UVic for 4 years. and then moved back to, the White Rock, South Surrey area, and then decided to move to Vancouver just for, pursuing some job opportunities. And so after I graduated university, I worked in Indigenous health at the Provincial Health Services Authority. And so we worked for an online Indigenous youth wellness program, which also focused on upstream suicide prevention. And so I really I felt like I was really kind of ingrained and just being around other Indigenous folks and just learning more about, our history and just working with youth really it was such a gift to have that job opportunity and to find reconnection through that process of working there. And so I think that's really what drew me to Vancouver, and I've sort of been here ever since.
I had no idea there was, is it an Indigenous wellness series, or what did you say it was?
Indigenous Youth Wellness Program. It was called Quiswi.
Oh, sweet.
So they've kind of expanded since. Like it's sort. I think their focus now is just Indigenous youth wellness, and they have a few different programs within that sort of broader program. Like they have Ask Auntie, which is specifically for young Indigenous girls and Indigenous women as well. But they also have Quiswi.
Oh, awesome. It's good to know that there's those resources and workshops and programs accessible to Indigenous youth out there in BC. When did you start to, so you worked in Indigenous wellness spaces, program coordinating. When was the transition for you into like writing and directing? Have you always been drawn to that, or was that something that you found later in life?
I was always sort of drawn to filmmaking. When I was in high school, I remember for a while I wanted to be an actor. This was like before university, which is kind of funny to me now because I'm like so uncomfortable in front of the camera. But at the time I was really drawn to that. And then I think, I was sort of at this point where, my parents were always very supportive in all aspects of what I was doing, but they really wanted me to go to university, and, all my best friends are going to university. And I think it was just an opportunity for me to kind of move away and just have, some of my own experiences. So I went to UVic for a few years, but I think while I was there, I was always just thinking about film. And at the time, there weren't any sort of film programs at UVic. And I think it was just something that was always in the back of my mind. And when I moved back to Vancouver and started working for this Indigenous Youth Wellness Program, we did a lot of video content for our online platform. So I sort of got into filmmaking through that. Like I had an amazing boss at the time who was just such an inspirational leader. And she was like, I think we were going to this one youth conference in Tofino, and she was like, do you want to just document this trip and just do some interviews with some youth? And so as soon as I did that, I just fell in love with it. And I really had a lot of support through that organization to just kind of learn through trial and error and teach myself how to film and how to edit. And then eventually I just felt like I wanted to really push myself and explore a few different, areas of filmmaking. And so I actually got into visual effects. And I studied at Vancouver Film School for about a year. And then I went and worked at a VFX company for about 9 months. But at that point, I wasn't really feeling fulfilled. I didn't feel like I was in charge of actually telling, my own stories. I was just kind of contributing to other projects. And so I was really searching to find more fulfillment through, the film industry. And so from there, I decided that I wanted to be writing and directing. And so I ended up leaving the VFX industry and went into filmmaking in about 2018, and I've been doing it ever since.
And I imagine like that transition, oftentimes we see the finished project, but we don't see like the trial and the errors and the lessons and the teachings along that journey. And I know sometimes for Indigenous people and just people in general, questioning like, where do you even begin? Like, where do you even start? And so I guess my question for you is like, what is your why? Like, what is your, I guess, like purpose and foundation that keeps you rooted no matter how many lessons you may learn?
I think what really drew me to the creating content and filmmaking was just thinking back to like my own childhood and my own experiences as a youth and just not having that representation. And I think, we're looking at all the different shows and all the different films that are out there right now, but there's just still such a lack in terms of Indigenous stories. And, sure, there are a couple stories here and there, but it doesn't represent, the various kind of cultures and different Indigenous people around, Turtle Island. And I think there's so many different experiences that we all have. And, we can't just assume that we can tell all those stories into one show. And so for me, I think that kind of drive is really just making sure that there are shows that, our youth can watch and feel uplifted and feel empowered by, and just see themselves represented on screen. So I think, there's certainly been times where I've questioned what I've been doing and have been like, oh, do I want to do this? Like, is there something else I could be doing? Or just kind of getting tired of just the constant, struggles that we face in this industry. But I think it always comes back to that initial, why am I doing this? And I think that's what's been pushing me along this entire time.
And I know there's there's kind of a shift. You kind of mentioned this already. There's kind of a shift where we're seeing more Indigenous representation, but oftentimes it is in a very limited or pan-Indigenized lens, and it's usually being told by someone that's non-Indigenous. And so I guess, what do you hope it starts to shift more within the film and media industry in itself?
I think just recognizing that in order to tell authentic Indigenous stories, like, we need to have Indigenous representation in all areas of production. Like, you can't just hire one Indigenous person and think that, that's representation, or that they can speak on behalf of all Indigenous people. Like, we need to see Indigenous people in the writing room, directing, producing, in different areas of the crew, actors. So I think, I've been seeing a lot of productions and a lot of shows that are really kind of taking on Indigenous stories, but I think, there's still this huge gap, and there's so much learning to be had on how we should be proceeding with these stories. And I think the best recent example would be, Reservation Dogs, because they had like an all Indigenous writing room. They had all Indigenous directors. They really brought up some emerging Indigenous directors and just took a chance on them and gave them their own episodes. An all Indigenous cast. So I think I would love to see more of that. And I think it really comes down to more risk taking in the industry, and just letting us be in charge of our own stories, right? Like, it's that narrative sovereignty that we're all seeking.
Well, and I think like it's almost like relinquishing like some power and some control and some access to resources and networks too. I think a lot of people, they like to talk about decolonization, not knowing that that's also providing, access to things that we have been historically missing throughout our lives. And I know for artists and directors and writers, there's often times where you question yourself, like, what I'm doing in this world, does it have purpose, and does it draw me back to the why? And so for you, before you write something, before you direct something, is there certain practices or maybe like protocols or routines that you follow to get inspired by?
I think so. I mean, really depends on the project. Like, it's always a question of like, okay, who is like leading this project? Who else have they hired? Like, am I the only Indigenous person on this project? And just making sure that if my name is attached to something, that I do feel proud of it, that I do feel like, there's other Indigenous folks who are being involved in this production. And so I think that's always something I'm mindful of when I, take something on. And I think, there's certainly been instances where I've committed to a project and realized that, they didn't have the best intentions. And I've learned a lot through that, being taken advantage of, being tokenized. And so I think now it's like I've learned some very hard lessons, and I think it's gone to the point where I'm hesitant. But at the same time, like I don't want to lose that trust when I'm kind of coming on a new project, but I also am being very mindful of making sure that I protect myself when I take these on.
Yeah, I guess like having a lot of boundaries and a lot of I think also like knowing your values and like, are we in alignment with the same values, and really coming back to like kinship and coming back to like true connection, I think is like Indigenous people we're also based within our community. And I think like, how can we bring this back into like working with non-Indigenous people too? Like at the end of the day, I feel like if you're working on production, you do have to be supportive of one another, and you do have to be in direct kinship and relation with one another. And I know you've worked on several different projects. And I'm curious, like, what for you has been one of the, I don't know, like for you, what was the most highlights of your career, one of the biggest highlights of your career so far, and maybe one of the biggest challenges for you so far?
That's a good question. I guess biggest highlight, I mean, there's been quite a few. I guess recently, like I did a short film this past summer And I got to work with Gawandio Tarbal, who's just amazing young Indigenous actor. And I think, that specific film was really inspired by my own kind of childhood, just kind of having a bit of disconnect, just being the only Indigenous girl, like in my school growing up, especially just being kind of in these very, like when I was living in White Rock, like it was a very white, community. So it was challenging, being the only Indigenous girl at my school throughout like elementary school, high school. And so I think just kind of doing a story that was so personal, and just working with some amazing, Indigenous artists was really, really a proud moment for me. And it's something that I'm really excited to share with people when the film is done. But, there's been a lot of different moments. I think one of my first kind of moments of realizing that this was what I was meant to be doing was when I premiered my first film at imagineNATIVE. And just being able to like surround myself with all these amazing Indigenous artists, it just felt like home to me. And it was kind of like, okay, this is like what I'm meant to be doing. This is where I'm meant to be. So I think that moment, just kind of realizing like that I've sort of found what I was looking for so long was really a special moment in my career.
And feeling connected to one another. And that's what I love about storytelling. And that's what I love about Indigenous storytelling is like, we don't necessarily have to explain to one another what we're going through, because on a subliminal level, we all understand at the end of the day. And I feel like movies and film and TV, they bring that sense, but it's like there's also a sense that's lacking our voices and the original like caretakers of the land. And there's a real lack of, of seeing Indigenous representation, not only within film, but within the like leadership positions, I guess you could say. And so I guess like for me, I would love to see more Indigenous inclusion within, like you're saying, the writing room and the producing and the directing and the higher ups. And so do you feel like non-Indigenous people are supporting the best way, or like what would your advice be for non-Indigenous people to support Indigenous stories in film and TV? I know. I'm like, that's a big question.
It's a big question. I think I'd like to think that people have good intentions, but I think, I think there needs to be a lot of work done to get to that point. Like for myself, like I think there's just really this lack of risk taking, which I kind of mentioned in terms of like creating content, but also just with hiring emerging, Indigenous directors. It seems like no one really wants to take a chance on us. And I think there's a lot of, the sort of this performative kind of allyship. And I think people are like, oh, like you can come shadow, but there's no intention of actually hiring us on future episodes. And it sort of just, I think, makes them feel better. And I think too, it's like, and not to say that there isn't anything beneficial from shadowing, because I've certainly learned so much being on set, but, if you are hiring people to shadow, like, there should be this kind of goal to get them to direct their own episode. And if you're having them on set shadowing, like make sure that you're paying them for that time that they, they're on set, because it is time that they're taking out of their days, that they're taking out of creating their own content. So I think there just needs to be more work done. And I think from what we've seen in terms of having more Indigenous writers, having more Indigenous directors really comes from like a top down, right? Like if you have an Indigenous showrunner, there is a huge difference in terms of who's getting hired. But I just feel like I've seen a lot of examples of, recently and in the past as well, is just like people taking on these Indigenous stories. They're hiring people, they're using their names when they're kind of marketing and saying, oh, we involved so-and-so, but that person wasn't necessarily there or really that involved. So there is I think there is a lot of exploitation still happening, which is certainly frustrating to see. So I think there could be a lot more meaningful collaboration that needs to be had.
And you brought up mentorship, and I often think of like mentorship, but like in a long-term way, like not checking the box and like, and actually being, actually like, I'm always thinking the longevity of something, and like it's not going to happen overnight. And I think people really want stuff to just happen overnight. And it's like, well, it's taken us how long to get to this point? It's going to take us this much more to heal and also have access to the stuff that has historically left us out. Like, I think that's a big thing that's missing too. Is I was just talking to Jacqueline Jennings, and she was saying not even having access to the resources that non-Indigenous people have has really, we've been left out of the economy, whether it's in film or media or TV or, you know, a whole nother business itself. We have been historically left out. And so how can we create more access to these resources, not only for ourselves, but for the next generation? And so I often think, you know, how can we support the next future generation of Indigenous entrepreneurs and content creators and filmmakers? What would your advice be for the younger generation if they're wanting to get more involved within this industry?
I think I just hope that, you know, younger Indigenous people know that they can do anything that they set their minds to, as long as they're willing to do the work. Like getting to my point in my career certainly hasn't been easy. And, you know, there's been so many hurdles and I'm still kind of experiencing hurdles. But I think if you really have a passion for something, you know, work hard at it, you know, surround yourself with people who support you, you can achieve anything you want to achieve.
And then I guess my other question I often ask is when you are feeling overwhelmed or lethargic or burnt out, what are tools and rituals and practices that you implement in your life to bring you back into your power and back into your wholeness?
I think I really kind of find a bit of, like, if I'm feeling a bit low, I like to just listen to music. I've also been teaching myself how to play the drums.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, so I've really been enjoying that. I just feel like it's a bit of a release. And it's also just fun to play. And then I also bought a Peloton earlier this year. So I've been kind of using that. If I'm just like really stressed out, I'll just like hop on the bike and, you know, kind of sweat it out a bit. But yeah, it sort of depends. Like, I mean, there's so many moments where sometimes you just need to like chat with someone, like chat with a friend, chat with a family member. So I'll just call someone up if I'm feeling low or just doubting myself or just need a bit of, you know, positivity. I'll just kind of call a friend and have some support in that sense.
And do you feel like there is a lot of support for Indigenous filmmakers within Vancouver itself?
I think so. I feel like there's a really great film community in Vancouver. And I think, you know, there's a lot of even non-Indigenous people who are doing a lot of great things to support Indigenous filmmakers. There are, like, although I kind of talk about a lot of the challenges, I think there are a lot of great allies as well. So I think that's important to recognize because, you know, sometimes we need that extra support once in a while. And I do feel like the community here is quite respectful and quite supportive of Indigenous filmmakers.
And I know throughout this conversation, we've talked a lot about community, and there's this concept of matriarchy. And like we have mentioned that no Indigenous person can speak for all of us. And so I'm curious to know, through your own lens and through your own, I guess, words and definition, when you think of matriarchy, what do you think of?
When I think of a matriarch, you know, I think of someone who, like, a very powerful, inspiring, female identifying leader, someone who uplifts others and shares their knowledge and teachings with those around them.
And are there current matriarchs that you are inspired by?
I think there's a lot of people in the industry, certainly, but I think just kind of thinking of the first person top of my head is my mom. And just seeing how she kind of came to Vancouver, you know, basically with nothing. Like, she left her home community to come to Vancouver and just kind of start fresh and just build a life for herself. And she's done so much just to, you know, be an incredible provider for me and my brother, and just created so many opportunities that, you know, we were able to experience as young people that she never got to experience when she was young. So I think, you know, she's always someone that I look up to.
Yeah, usually our mothers are like the first ones that are always being brought up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And like moving forward, I guess for you and your work, what is on the horizon for you? What do you hope for within your own future and within your own storytelling and within your own writing and directing? What are stories that you yourself want to be sharing with the world?
There's so many. I feel like right now, like, I'm developing a television show just about this group of urban Indigenous women just navigating, their careers, relationships in the city of Vancouver. And I think we haven't really seen a show like that. Something that's not necessarily Sex and the City, but something kind of in that vein, right? Where it's just like this group of friends and it's celebrating sisterhood. So that's something I've been working on that I'm really excited about. And then I'm also trying to adapt a novel about an Indigenous girl growing up in this suburban town and just kind of, going through high school and the trials and tribulations of what it is to be, an Indigenous woman kind of growing up in this community. And I feel like it's very similar to kind of my own experiences of growing up. And just kind of tackling so many different topics that haven't been told. So I think there's some that are like directly kind of inspired from my own childhood, but then also pulling from experiences that I've experienced as a, urban Indigenous woman and things that I think a lot of us have also experienced and have just kind of gotten frustrated with. And so I've actually created this list of just things that have happened to me that I'm like, okay, I'm going to pull inspiration from this event and pull it into a show. So I think that's right now, that's sort of my focus is really just hopefully, being in control of some of these shows that I'm developing and making sure that I'm, bringing up other emerging, Indigenous directors and writers and making sure that there is ownership over these stories as well. Like that's something that's been quite a push is trying to make sure that, if I am kind of taking on a project to make sure that I do have ownership and control over it, because that seems to be a big hurdle. And I think a lot of the times when you bring a project to someone, they're like, oh, but like, you're not that experienced, so we'd want to bring in this person. But it's like, no, you can't have a non-Indigenous person leading this project because it's not going to be authentic, So I think when it's stories that are just so personal, there is a lot of kind of concerns, I think, that come up when you do want to take that next push. And I just think navigating the industry in general can be quite difficult at times.
Well, and because there's I feel like there's a lack of mentorship, really. Like if you haven't seen yourself in that role before, you sometimes don't know what exists for you. And I feel like in storytelling, I feel like sometimes too within production and within these shows, it's not necessarily like safe for an Indigenous person. It's not necessarily, you don't feel safe sometimes. Like it's like this place isn't meant for me. I feel like sometimes that can be a subconscious thing going on set. And honestly, for me, when I was younger, that's one of the reasons why I left acting industry, is because a lot of the times I didn't feel safe. And so I like that you mentioned that you are also thinking about being an actor, but now that you've transitioned to the writing and the producing and the directing sides, because like hopefully in those positions you have more control over the stories and what's being shared and told. So yeah, I have
absolutely.
Yeah. And I also realize, as an actor, writer, director, producer, there are different processes that we go through when we're wanting to share that story. And so you already mentioned that you pick up things that you experience yourself, but are there other places that you draw inspiration and wisdom from for what you're creating in the world?
I think so. Definitely like pulling from just things within like my own family, maybe something that I've seen or read about or just kind of, I think I get inspiration from just being out and about on the daily and just seeing things and or just reading things or hearing things. Like it can come from music. I feel like there's so many different areas to get inspiration from. And also too, I think just seeing all the other work that, Indigenous artists are doing is just really inspiring. And I think it's a really beautiful time to kind of be a storyteller, because there is a shift that's happening. And of course, there's still lots of work that needs to be done. But I think, it's an exciting time. And I think hopefully that the work that we're doing now will really pave the way for the next generation so that they don't have to deal with as much, of the hardships that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. Well, I think even just having this conversation and letting other people know that there is a lot of challenges that are happening, and it's normal to feel burnt out or maybe to feel like overwhelmed at times. But there is also this concept of having hope for the future and the next generations and of Indigenous futurism. And so through your own lens, what do you hope for Indigenous futurism?
The thing about Indigenous futurism that is exciting is that it's really just this transformation of our own narrative and just taking control of our own narrative. And it's narrative sovereignty. It's showing that we're still here. It's showing our future and what that could look like and what we are capable of. And I think that's so important for the next generation to see that, whether it's, in film, television, whether it's through a graphic novel. Like, there's so many different avenues that we can explore Indigenous futurism. So I think it's just important that it's ingrained in all different areas of what we see on the daily, and just showing that we have so much potential to really kind of take control and ownership and change the narrative that we've been seeing for so long, which really is kind of, not an accurate depiction of who we are as Indigenous people.
Well, and I think you're one of the driving forces that is paving that way. And I know a lot of listeners will want to support your work and probably watch your work. And so where can people support your work and find you?
I think the best way to find my work is through my website, which is www.asiayoungman.com. And I try to update it when I can and post links to some of my work. So I think that would be the best way, or maybe through social media, which I'm not as active on as I should be, but it's there. People check it out.
It's sweet. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Asia, for taking this time to share a little bit about your journey. And I look forward to seeing all your films come out. That sounds awesome. Like the Indigenous woman Sex and the City. I'm going to be waiting for that one.
Thanks, Shayla. Thank you for having with me and chatting.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I would love your feedback. Follow me on Instagram at Shayla0H, at Matriarch.Movement, and don't forget to subscribe on the pod platform of your choice and review and rate where possible. Hi. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening to a podcast by The Brand is Female. I'm Ava Hartling, and this episode was produced by our team. Sound engineering by Isabel Morris. Research and production support, Claire Miglionico. Marketing and digital growth, Kayla Gillis. And partnerships, Natalie Hope.